It's time for the second part of my April wrap-up, where I chat about all the books that I read during the second half of April. So stick around to see what they were. Well, hey everybody, Roger here, and welcome to my channel, Roger's Reads. So today I'm doing part 2 of my April wrap-up. So this is my April month-end wrap-up. I read a total of 12 books during the month of April, with 6 books during the second half. So all in all, not too bad of a reading month. So the first book that I read this month was entitled Keep This to Yourself by Tom Ryan. So this was an advanced reader copy that was available at NetGalley, and the premise sounded so interesting that I requested it, and it ended up being really a fascinating story. So this follows 18-year-old Mac Bell, who is still reeling from his best friend's Connor's murder the year before. So a year ago, 4 people were killed by a serial killer who then suddenly stopped. People assumed that he was a random drifter who came into town, murdered 4 people, and then moved on. But when Mac finds a cryptic note from Connor that was written on the day of his murder, Mac is once again thrust into the case, determined to find out what happened to his friend. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Mac now believes that because of the contents of the note, that he may have been able to prevent his friend's murder on that day, making him all the more determined to solve his friend's death when the police could not. So this book hooked me right from the get-go, and once Mac decides to investigate, the tension and the pace never slow down as Mac becomes more and more obsessed with uncovering the truth. The story also had one of my favorite tropes, that is, the one in which nobody can be believed, resulting in quite a few interesting twists and turns. Then things really get interesting once Mac begins to suspect that the killer never left Camera Cove and has been here the entire time. So all in all, I thought that this story was an absolute gem. It was a terrific thriller that kept me guessing right until the utterly shocking ending. You know, the story had kind of a Murder, She Wrote vibe to it, but instead of Jessica Fletcher, we have a busybody teen boy, and I thought that this aspect of it was a lot of fun. So Mac ended up being a delightful young gay detective, but most of all, I loved the fact that I did not guess the ending, and I was totally taken by surprise by the huge reveal at the end. So yes, excellent read. The second book that I read during the month of April was entitled The Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. So this is the second book in the Strange the Dreamer duology, the first being Strange the Dreamer, and really I could not wait to tear into this. Now I'm going to admit here that I'm usually afraid to read the second book in this series, as my experience has shown that they often disappoint. But I needn't have worried. This book was phenomenal and was an unequivocal 5-star read for me, just like the first one was. So this story immediately picks up where the first novel left off, after the wake of tragedy, and we're instantly thrust into conflict. So now all of our characters, both humans and Godspawn, have to figure out how they fit into this new world and how they are to prevent the destruction of Weep due to somebody's single-minded focus for vengeance. And those of you who read the first book know exactly who I'm talking about. So as such, Laszlo needs to make an impossible choice: to sacrifice the woman he loves or sacrifice everyone else in Weep. Now there's also a new enemy also intent on vengeance, and with this enemy comes answers to many questions that we all wondered about from the first book, such as who are the gods and where did the gods come from? What did they want? Where did all of the hundreds or thousands of God-spawned children go? And how did Laszlo end up as an orphan as a baby? So Muse of Nightmares also introduces us to two new characters, Cora and Nova, two sisters born long before the last god spawn, but whose stories quickly entangle with the characters from the first book, answering all of our questions in the process. So the world building here is epic, massive, detailed, and absolutely phenomenal as we delve into multiple worlds and dimensions in this story, with each of them being related. I was completely gobsmacked by the many unexpected directions the story went in, and as the author gave us surprise after surprise after surprise. The story was also heartbreaking in places and heart-mending in others, as it's a story about loss, trauma, grief, hate, revenge, and destruction. But it's also about love, healing, salvation, and redemption. The book was so beautifully written with lush lyrical prose that stayed with me long after I finished the story, and it made reading this book such a rich experience. You know, it's incredible how much emotion the author manages to portray and evoke through her poetic words, and I felt that the storytelling here is unparalleled. You know, I teared up quite a few times during this immersive book and found this to be one of the most moving stories I've read in a while. Now, I didn't think Laini Taylor could write a better book than Strange the Dreamer, but she managed to pull it off with the Muse of Nightmares. Now, one thing I want to mention is that I did consume this in audiobook format, which was narrated by Steve West, the same narrator who did Strange the Dreamer. And again, his work is breathtaking, and he really managed to bring the story to life. He is now my official favorite audiobook narrator. So I never really understood the term book hangover until I finished this story, because this book wrecked me for several days afterwards, but in the best possible of ways. You know, it was really difficult for me to say goodbye to these lovely characters, and I hope that Ms. Taylor writes more books in this world. And I have heard some gossip or some rumors that she is writing another book in this world, and I certainly hope so, because I will be first in line to get it. So the third book that I read during the month of April was a book entitled The Night Before by Wendy Walker. So this is a thriller that follows Laura Lochner, who, after a devastating breakup, quits her Wall Street job and flees to Connecticut to stay with her sister Rosie. So Laura has had kind of a sordid past and has even been declared by her mother as difficult to love from birth. Hell, even Laura refers to herself as broken. But she's determined to put the past behind her, including a horrendous event 11 years earlier that has pretty much defined her entire life. So she's now looking to start fresh and begin dating again even. So one night, she heads out on a first date with a man named Jonathan Fields, a man she met on the internet through a dating service called, I think it was FindLove.com. But when Laura doesn't come home the next day, Rosie becomes more than a little bit worried. As the day goes on, Rosie and her husband become more and more concerned, and they, along with a childhood friend, begin investigating on their own. You see, the kicker here is that Rosie isn't necessarily worried about what Jonathan may have done to Laura, but instead what Laura may have done to Jonathan. I know, right? So what's fun about this book is that it's told from different points of views and different timelines, so you can see how the evening of Laura's date progresses, the progress of Rose's investigation, as well as the dirt behind that horrid event that happened when Laura was in high school. So at some point here, I ended up questioning just about everything that occurred in the book, because I was at a complete loss as to the direction where the story was heading. I kind of thought that I had it figured out a couple of times, but the ingenious plot twists proved me wrong, for which I was happy. You know, I read a lot of thrillers, and I love it when an author still manages to surprise me with an original premise, and one that sent me in many different directions as this one did. So all in all, The Night Before was a perfectly paced, riveting story with a thoroughly satisfying and neatly tied up conclusion. So this is my first Wendy Walker novel I've read, and I will assuredly be checking out more of this author's work. And in the spirit of disclosure, I did receive an advanced reader copy of this book from the publisher, and as usual, all opinions are my own. So the fourth book that I read during the second half of April was entitled The Cost of Living by Emilie Lacadamo. So this is an urban fantasy story that follows our main character Beck, who wakes up naked on the sidewalk in the rain. Now he's feeling exceptionally hungover and sick, and for the life of him, he can't recall how he ended up in such a precarious situation. So luckily, a young bookshop owner named Adam finds Beck and takes him back to his bookstore. So Adam helps Beck to recover, and then he has to break the news to Beck about what really happened to him. So as it turns out, Beck died 7 months ago, so he was dead. I mean, really dead. In fact, his body was even cremated, so you really can't get much more dead than that. Yet, here he is. So as it turns out, Beck is due back to a necromancy ritual that went horribly wrong. And as Beck soon learns, his return from the dead isn't the only repercussion from this spell. He also discovers that there's a lot more to Adam than the helpful fellow who found him on the street. So I was unaware that this is actually the second book in this series. When I requested this, I had no idea. But luckily, the book seemed to stand on its own quite well. So I ended up really enjoying this book. I found it fascinating following Beck as he reintroduced himself back into the life of his friends and his brother, and seeing the fallout and the shock that resulted from Beck appearing on their doorstep. I mean, imagine it. More fascinating was journeying along with Beck and Adam as they tried to solve the mystery of Beck's resurrection, which led to the battling of an evil that was rising quickly. So I thought the premise here was fresh and original, and I love the unusual paranormal twist in this novel. I also really liked the witty banter between the characters, though the characters probably could have been a little better developed. This is actually quite a short novel, and because of that, not enough ample time was devoted for the reader to really get to know the characters and their motivations, in my opinion. So this definitely could have been a little longer. And that being said, the story felt a tad rushed to me towards the end. But all in all, it was an enjoyable read with likable characters, and I do plan on picking up the other books in this series. Now, this was another advanced reader copy that I received in exchange for an honest review, and as usual, all opinions are my own. And yes, I played a little bit of catch-up in April with my advanced reader copies, and I still have some more exciting ones coming up for the month of May. So the fifth book that I read during the second half of April was entitled The Prince of Air and Darkness. So I was excited to read this, as there really aren't a lot of queer fantasy adventure books out there, especially about the fairy courts. So this is the first book in the Darkest Courts series, and the story follows two young men at Mather's School of Magic. Phineas Smith, a human who has the ability to tap into the powerful and potentially deadly ley line, giving him access to unlimited power, and Rourke Lynn, the beautiful fey Unseelie Prince. So the two of them are roommates, though they don't get on together all that well, with both attempting to ignore the sexual tension between them. Now, Phineas is the only human at the school because of his ley line ability, though in the 6 years that he's spent there, he's been unable to control his powerful magic. But regardless, both the fairy courts, the Seelie and the Unseelie, want Finn on their side, as a civil war between the two courts is brewing in the background. Now, Rourke is determined to teach Finn how to master his magic, so the two men come together to form sort of an alliance that grows more and more dangerous as the two begin to acknowledge their feelings for each other. So I really enjoyed the tension of the slow burn romance between Finn and Rourke. But then again, I typically enjoy the enemies to lovers / frenemies to lovers trope. And there was definitely a searing chemistry, a heat between these two, no matter how hard they tried to fight their feelings for each other. And though this is a romance, it is not an erotic romance. I don't believe that there were any overly explicit love scenes in the story. I think most of them were fade to black, if I remember correctly. And the romance is really secondary to the fairy court intrigue, though the two are pretty tightly entwined. But all in all, I love this book. From start to finish, the book held me in rapt attention, as I felt that the melange of the fairy court politics and intrigue, a magic school, and a romance all worked wonderfully together in this book. So the two main characters were complex, multi-layered, well fleshed out, and likable. I also thought that the pacing of the story was perfect, and the author creates an atmosphere of constant tension and unease. And the story ended up with a happily ever after for our guys, and I really cared about these two making it to that happy ending. And the journey that takes them there results in an utterly remarkable read. Now let me say that the story is a little bit of a cliffhanger, as it concluded with a war between the Seelie and the Unseelie courts on the horizon, which will no doubt be explained in the next book in the series. And I definitely do plan on continuing on with this series. So the last book that I read in the second half of April was entitled The Immortalists, written by Chloe Benjamin. So I guess this is a literary fiction novel with just a smidgen of a magical realism thrown in. Or perhaps not. That's up to the reader to decide. So this book asks the question, if you knew the date of your death, how would you live your life? So the story starts off in 1969 and follows the Gold Children, 4 of them, who sneak out to get their fortunes told by a mysterious woman who, according to a local gossip, has the ability to tell you the date that you're going to die. So each of the children, one by one, is called in by the psychic, and each one is informed of their death day. So then they all have to cope with this heavy bit of information, and we get to see to what extent it determines how they live their lives. So then we get their story one child at a time, and the book is actually segmented into sections separated by each child's story, and we follow them to the last moments in their lives. So in so doing, we get to see how their life unfolds knowing this tidbit of information. These dire prophecies drive them forward for the rest of their lives, seemingly influencing their decision and maybe even changing the entire course of their lives. So some of them end up more reckless and take more risks than they might have otherwise, while others remain more cautious than they may have otherwise. So as I read along, I thought it was interesting how the reader is prompted to wonder just how much of our lives are controlled by destiny or sheer luck, if you will, and how much of it is controlled by our own conscious choices and decisions. Interestingly, the fate of one of the characters specifically gave me pause and caused me to ask whether receiving such a dire prediction like the Gold Children did could cause us to force those events to come to pass when they may not have occurred otherwise. So in this way, having too much information could end up working against us. Or in the case of the Gold Children, the question remains, was the fortune teller right? And if so, did the children possess the power to change the course of their own fates and decide their own destiny? That is to say, is our destiny predetermined, or do we have a hand in changing its outcome? The story also made me wonder whether knowing our death date would cause us to live our lives to the fullest, or would we instead live with fear and dread of what's coming. And in the case of our four characters, we can't help but wonder whether their lives would have turned out the way they did had they not visited the fortune teller. So this is definitely the kind of book that makes you uncomfortable while reading it. It's a tough read in places, raw even. It's a challenging novel that forces you to consider profound themes such as life and death, destiny versus free will, magic versus science, religion, our tendency towards self-fulfilling prophecy, and regret, just to mention a few. So it's no surprise then that the story is heartbreaking in more than a few places, but it's also a deep, beautiful and magical story. This is an incredible book, and I fell more and more in love with it as we progressed through each child's story. I love seeing how the fortune teller's prediction impacted all of their lives, resulting in a riveting character study at the end of the day. All in all, this is a magnificent exploration of some heavy topics, and I ended up giving this book 5 stars. We're actually reading this for my in-person book club in May this month, so I'm really looking forward to a discussion that should prove to be quite interesting. So how about you? What did you read in April? Let me know in the comments. And that about does it for my April wrap-up part 2. As always, I thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all your support. And if you like this video, I'd appreciate if you click the like button below, as it helps my channel out. And that'll do it. I'll talk to you in the next video. Roger and out.